Vivian Hayes controlled a technology empire worth billions of dollars. One nod from her could send hundreds of executives scrambling to sign whatever deal she proposed. Boardrooms rearranged their calendars around her schedule, and competitors studied her every move like scripture. Yet the one man she truly needed would not even look at her twice. Lucas Carter, the quiet owner of a worn industrial repair shop, turned down offers worth tens of millions of dollars without so much as blinking. Money meant nothing to him, and that single fact unsettled Vivian more than any hostile takeover ever had. When persuasion failed, when contracts failed, when every strategy she had ever used on powerful men failed against this one ordinary mechanic, she finally asked him a single question. If not for money, what would make him stand up and fight again? His answer, spoken quietly in a dusty workshop that smelled of oil and steel, would change the course of both their lives forever. The city had once been a giant. Decades earlier, its factories ran day and night, and the sound of machinery was the sound of a heartbeat that never stopped. Now, most of those buildings stood half empty, their windows broken, their parking lots overtaken by weeds pushing through cracked asphalt. Whole neighborhoods had learned to live with silence where there used to be noise, and that silence carried its own kind of weight. Businesses had moved away one by one, chasing cheaper labor and newer cities, leaving behind workers who still remembered what it felt like to matter. In the middle of all that quiet decline sat a small repair shop with a faded sign and a single working light above the door. Lucas Carter had run that shop for nearly a decade. His clients were not large corporations with endless budgets, but small manufacturers, family-owned workshops, and struggling factories trying to survive one more season. Word about him spread the way important things spread in a place like that, not through advertising, but through the low, steady voice of people who trusted each other. Engineers twice his age would drive for hours just to have him look at a machine no one else could fix. He never posted photographs of his work, never sought interviews, never allowed a single camera crew through his door. He fixed what was broken and let the machine speak for him. There was a rhythm to the way Lucas moved through his shop, the same rhythm every single day, and people who watched him long enough began to understand why. He arrived before sunrise and left after dark, his hands stained permanently with grease that no amount of soap could fully remove. He rarely spoke more than necessary, choosing silence over small talk, and yet everyone who worked with him described him the same way: disciplined, honest, impossible to rush, and impossible to fool. He carried himself the way a much older man might, someone who had already learned the hardest lessons and had no patience left for pretending. Around town, a certain phrase had become something like local wisdom. If Lucas Carter agrees to take the job, the factory survives. If he refuses, everyone quietly understood the machine, and sometimes the business behind it, was already beyond saving. That reputation reached further than Lucas ever intended, eventually catching the attention of corporations who wanted to buy not just his skill, but his name. Large firms sent representatives with generous offers, hoping to attach his reputation to their brand. Every single one of them left with the same answer: a calm, unshaken refusal that no amount of zeros could change. Older residents liked to say that Lucas had inherited more than a trade from the men who trained him. He had inherited a certain code of behavior that most of the newer generation had quietly abandoned. He believed a signature meant something, that a promise made over a handshake carried the same weight as one printed on official paper. Younger workers who apprenticed under him for even a few months often left with more than technical knowledge, carrying instead a stricter sense of what honest labor was supposed to look like. He never explained these values directly, choosing instead to demonstrate them through the quiet consistency of his daily routine. That consistency, more than any advertisement could have accomplished, became the foundation of everything people believed about him. It was that same refusal, repeated over years to men far more powerful than most people would ever meet, that finally reached Vivian Hayes. She had built her company from nothing into one of the most valuable technology firms in the country, and she had never once encountered a person who was simply not interested in what she offered. Something about that fact bothered her in a way she could not immediately explain. So instead of sending another representative, another contract, another wire transfer, she decided to do something she almost never did anymore. She decided to go herself. Vivian arrived at the shop on a gray afternoon, stepping out of a car that looked entirely out of place on that cracked street. She was 35 years old, sharp-eyed, and accustomed to rooms falling silent the moment she walked into them. Every decision she made was calculated. Every conversation shaped toward an outcome she had already predicted before it began. She had built her reputation on getting exactly what she wanted, and she saw no reason this visit would be any different. In her hand she carried a leather folder, holding an offer large enough to change most people's lives within a single signature. Lucas did not stop working when she entered. He barely looked up from the engine in front of him, his hands still moving with the same unhurried precision they always had. Vivian introduced herself, laid out the terms of her offer, and waited for the reaction she was used to seeing, the flicker of excitement, the barely hidden calculation behind a stranger's eyes. Instead, Lucas wiped his hands on a rag, looked at her directly, for the first time, and spoke a single sentence that would echo through the rest of her week. "I am sorry," he said, "but I do not sell my time." Vivian assumed, reasonably enough given her experience, that this was simply the opening move of a negotiation. She raised the offer twice, then a third time, watching his face for any sign of hesitation that never came. Lucas continued working as though the conversation had already ended, occasionally answering her questions, but never once glancing at the folder she had placed on his workbench. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Vivian Hayes stood in a room and realized she had absolutely no leverage at all. No number seemed to matter, no title impressed him, and no argument moved him even slightly from his position. She left the shop that afternoon more confused than angry, turning the encounter over in her mind long after her car had pulled away from the curb. Before leaving, she had tried one final approach, offering him not just money but naming rights, a partnership title, and creative control over an entire division of her company. Lucas simply shook his head, thanked her for the coffee she had not brought that first day, and returned his attention to the machine waiting patiently on his lift. Her assistant, waiting outside in the car, later said Vivian did not speak a single word during the entire ride back to the office. Those who worked closely with her recognized the silence as something rare, a sign that she was processing an outcome her instincts had completely failed to predict. She replayed the conversation over and over, searching for the moment she had miscalculated, but found nothing resembling a mistake in her approach. The problem, she began to suspect uneasily, was not her strategy at all, but something about the man himself that no strategy could ever reach. That night, alone in an office far removed from the smell of oil and steel, Vivian sat with a question she had never needed to ask before. She could not understand how a man with almost nothing had said no to almost everything, and the not knowing bothered her more than losing any deal ever had. Curiosity, once it took root in Vivian, rarely stayed quiet for long. She began quietly gathering information about Lucas Carter, treating the search the way she treated any unfamiliar market, methodically and without emotion at first. What she found did not match the picture of a simple small-town mechanic at all. Years earlier, Lucas had worked in finance, and not in some minor role either. He had been considered brilliant, the kind of young analyst that investment firms fought over, courted with signing bonuses most people never saw in a decade. He had made enormous amounts of money in a remarkably short period of time, moving numbers on screens that translated into real consequences for real people far away. Then, according to every record Vivian could find, he simply vanished from that world entirely. No public statement, no dramatic resignation announced to the press, no scandal that anyone could point to as an obvious explanation. He closed his accounts, left the city where he had built his career, and reappeared years later, running a small repair shop in a town most investors had long since written off. The gap between those two versions of the same man made no logical sense to Vivian, and she found herself unable to simply let the question go. The deeper she looked, the more the picture shifted from confusing to something closer to admirable. Though she resisted using that word even in her own thoughts, she discovered that Lucas frequently repaired equipment for struggling businesses without charging them a single dollar. Machines that would have otherwise forced entire workshops to close their doors for good. Small manufacturers who could not afford new equipment came to him quietly, and just as quietly, he sent them away with working machines and no invoice attached. He never mentioned these repairs to anyone, never used them to build a reputation beyond the narrow circle of people who already trusted him. Vivian found records, whispered stories, and grateful former clients, but never once found Lucas taking credit for any of it. There was a particular case that stayed with her longer than the rest. A small parts manufacturer on the edge of town that had been days away from shutting down permanently. Lucas had spent an entire week rebuilding their primary production line, working through nights, without asking for compensation of any kind. The business survived, 40 jobs were saved, and the owner later said Lucas refused even a modest thank you payment offered out of gratitude. Vivian read that account twice, then a third time, trying to understand the calculation behind a decision that made no financial sense to her at all. In her world, every action had a corresponding return, a reason, a strategy hidden somewhere beneath the surface. Lucas seemed to operate by an entirely different set of rules, ones she had never been taught and had certainly never practiced herself. She also found, buried deep within old public filings, the name of the firm Lucas had once worked for, a company still well known within financial circles for its aggressive approach to restructuring struggling companies. Vivian recognized several of the names listed alongside his in those old records, executives who had gone on to build enormous fortunes, while the workers beneath their decisions rarely appeared in any headline at all. She found no evidence that Lucas had ever spoken publicly about his departure, no interview, no statement, no bitter account settling old scores with former colleagues. His silence, consistent across every version of his story she could find, told her more than any explanation might have. Whatever had happened, he had chosen to carry it quietly, rather than turn it into a narrative that painted him as either victim or hero. That restraint impressed her almost as much as the discoveries themselves, and it deepened the growing sense that she had misjudged him entirely from the very beginning. By the time she closed her laptop that evening, something inside Vivian had shifted from simple curiosity into something closer to genuine fascination. She had spent her entire adult life surrounded by people who wanted something from her, who smiled with calculated warmth while quietly measuring her usefulness. Lucas Carter wanted nothing from her at all, and that alone made him unlike anyone she had ever encountered in her professional life. She began to wonder what kind of person walked away from wealth and influence entirely, choosing grease-stained hands over boardrooms most people would kill to sit inside. The question followed her into sleep that night, and it was still there, unresolved, when she woke the next morning. Vivian returned to the shop, but this time she left the leather folder locked in her car. She told herself the visit was simply another step in understanding a business decision, though even she recognized how thin that explanation had become. Instead of negotiating, she brought 2 cups of coffee and set one quietly on the edge of his workbench without a word. Lucas glanced at the cup, then at her, offering the faintest suggestion of a smile before returning to the engine in front of him. Neither of them mentioned contracts, salaries, or corporate structures. And for the first time since they had met, the silence between them felt comfortable rather than strategic. Over the following days, those visits became something close to a routine neither of them had planned or discussed aloud. Vivian would arrive in the late afternoon, sit on an old stool near the workbench, and simply watch Lucas work with the same quiet focus he brought to everything he touched. Their conversations grew slowly, moving from careful small talk into subjects that felt far more personal than either of them had intended to share. They spoke about work and what it meant to actually build something, rather than simply managing numbers that represented other people's labor. They spoke about honesty, about responsibility, about the strange gap between what a thing is worth on paper and what it is actually worth to the people who depend on it. One afternoon, while adjusting a stubborn valve that had resisted every attempt to fix it, Lucas said something that stayed with Vivian far longer than he likely intended. "Machines do not know how to lie," he told her, running his hand along a worn piece of metal like it deserved respect. "They break because something inside them failed, not because they decided to deceive you for their own benefit." Vivian laughed at first, assuming it was simply an offhand comment from a man who spent too much time alone with engines. But that night, lying awake in an apartment worth more than most of the buildings on his street, she could not stop turning the sentence over in her mind. She had spent years surrounded by people who smiled while lying, who negotiated with hidden motives buried beneath every polite word they offered her. Lucas, by contrast, seemed incapable of that kind of performance, incapable of saying something he did not fully mean. Slowly, without either of them naming it directly, the relationship between Vivian and Lucas began shifting into something neither business nor purely personal. She stopped thinking of him as a target to convince, and started thinking of him as someone whose opinion had begun to matter to her in ways she did not fully understand. Lucas, for his part, seemed to notice the change too, though he said nothing about it, choosing instead to simply keep the second coffee cup waiting on the corner of his workbench each time she arrived. There were small rituals, neither of them planned, that began to define those afternoons together. The way Lucas always cleared a second stool before she arrived, the way Vivian learned to sit quietly instead of filling every silence with questions. She began noticing details about him she had missed entirely during their first tense meeting. The careful way he labeled every tool, the patience he showed apprentices who came by asking for advice. He, in turn, noticed that the woman who had once arrived in tailored suits, carrying leather folders, had slowly stopped performing the role of chief executive around him entirely. She asked questions now not to extract information for a negotiation, but because she genuinely wanted to understand how a person built a life around something other than ambition. Neither of them named what was forming between them, unwilling to risk disturbing something that still felt fragile and unfamiliar to both. But anyone watching closely would have noticed that Vivian Hayes, a woman known for controlling every room she entered, had finally found a place where she simply allowed herself to listen. It was on one of those quiet afternoons, with rain tapping softly against the metal roof of the shop, that Lucas finally spoke about the years he had spent away from machines entirely. He told her about his early career in finance, about the excitement of watching numbers move in his favor, about how easy it had once been to mistake momentum for meaning. He described a particular deal, one among many he had worked on, that had seemed at the time like just another routine transaction. A factory was restructured for the sake of efficiency, a decision that looked purely mathematical on every spreadsheet involved in the process. Months later, that same factory closed its doors permanently, and thousands of workers lost jobs they had held for most of their adult lives. Lucas explained, in a voice quieter than Vivian had ever heard from him, that he had not personally made the final decision to close the factory. He had simply been one voice among many, one set of calculations feeding into a much larger machine that no single person seemed to fully control. And yet, he told her, he could never fully separate himself from what happened afterward, no matter how many times he tried to reason his way out of the guilt. He had seen photographs later, families standing outside locked gates, men who had given decades of their lives to a building that no longer wanted them. Those images never left him. Following him through every subsequent success his career handed him afterward. Not long after, Lucas made the decision that had confused so many people who once knew him professionally. He walked away from finance entirely, closing accounts that held more money than most people would ever see, and disappeared from that version of his life completely. He told Vivian he never wanted to build wealth from decisions he could not fully see the human cost of again. Instead, he chose work he could hold in his own two hands, machines whose failures and successes were entirely visible, entirely honest, entirely his own responsibility to fix or fail. For the first time since they had met, Vivian saw something in his expression that resembled genuine vulnerability rather than calm control. It was the closest she had ever come to understanding the man sitting across from her. And it changed the way she saw everything that followed. He told her about the months afterward, the ones spent driving without any real destination, stopping in small towns that reminded him of nothing and everything at once. He described the moment he first walked past a repair shop with a hand-painted sign and a mechanic patiently explaining a problem to an elderly customer, and how something about that scene had settled a restlessness inside him he had carried for years. He took an apprenticeship not because he needed the money, but because he needed to remember what it felt like to fix something, and immediately see the result of his own hands. There was no dramatic turning point, he told her. No single sunrise that changed everything. Only a slow accumulation of ordinary days that eventually became a different kind of life entirely. Vivian listened without interrupting, recognizing in his story a kind of courage she had never previously associated with walking away from success. It took more strength, she realized, to abandon a path everyone admired than to simply keep following it out of habit. Not long after that rainy afternoon, news broke that shook the entire region and pulled both Vivian and Lucas back into a much larger conflict. An old manufacturing plant on the outskirts of the city, one that had survived decades of economic decline, was now facing final closure within a matter of weeks. If the factory shut its doors, thousands of workers would lose their jobs immediately, and the surrounding town, already struggling, would likely never fully recover. Vivian happened to be involved in a much larger international deal that touched the very same industry, though from an entirely different angle than most people realized. Her company stood to gain enormous value from restructuring decisions that treated the factory as little more than a line item to be optimized. Lucas, meanwhile, saw only the people who worked inside that building. Men and women whose entire lives were tied to machines he understood better than most engineers ever would. The two of them visited the factory together, walking through corridors filled with the low hum of machines still running on borrowed time. Vivian studied the equipment with the practiced eye of someone calculating potential returns, mentally sorting profitable assets from expendable liabilities. Lucas studied the same equipment differently, noticing which machines had been kept running through obvious skill and dedication rather than corporate investment. He introduced Vivian to workers who had spent 20, sometimes 30 years inside that building, people who spoke about the factory the way others might speak about family. Vivian listened, though something in her expression suggested she was hearing these stories in a way she never had before. For the first time in her career, the numbers on her spreadsheet felt disconnected from the reality standing directly in front of her. That night, standing outside the factory as the last shift ended and workers filed out into the cold evening air, something inside Vivian began to shift permanently. She had spent her entire career believing that value could be measured entirely through data, projections, and carefully modeled outcomes. Watching Lucas greet workers by name, ask about their families, and listen patiently to concerns that had nothing to do with efficiency, she began to question that belief for the first time. A business, she realized slowly, was never simply a collection of numbers arranged on a page for investors to evaluate. It was built from thousands of small human decisions, loyalty, sacrifice, and quiet dedication that no spreadsheet could ever fully capture or explain. Standing beside Lucas in that fading evening light, Vivian understood that everything she thought she knew about running a company was about to be tested. One older worker, a woman named Diane who had operated the same press machine for nearly 25 years, pulled Vivian aside briefly before her shift began that evening. She spoke plainly, without any attempt to flatter or persuade, describing what it meant to raise 2 children on wages earned inside that building. She was not asking for sympathy, only for someone in power to understand that the factory was not an abstract asset waiting to be optimized on a spreadsheet somewhere far away. Vivian thanked her, and found she meant it in a way that surprised her. A sincerity that had little to do with public relations or careful messaging. Later that night, she found herself unable to stop thinking about Diane's voice, steady and unguarded, describing decades of loyalty to a place that had almost forgotten to return it. It was a small conversation, only a few minutes long, yet it lodged itself permanently among the reasons Vivian would later give for changing her mind. The pressure surrounding the factory continued building over the following days, pulling both of them deeper into a situation neither could easily walk away from anymore. Vivian's own board grew impatient, pushing her toward the fastest, most profitable resolution regardless of what it would mean for the people inside that building. She found herself caught between two versions of leadership she had never had to choose between so directly before. One version had made her successful, ruthless, efficient, and utterly convinced that hesitation was simply another word for weakness. The other version, the one slowly taking shape inside her since meeting Lucas, whispered that success measured only in numbers might not be success worth having at all. She needed an answer. And more than that, she needed to understand what kind of leader she actually wanted to become. It was during this period of mounting pressure that Vivian finally asked Lucas the question that had been building inside her since their very first conversation. They stood together near the factory gates one evening, watching workers arrive for the closing shift under a sky heavy with clouds. Vivian turned to him and asked quietly, if not for money, what would make him stand up and fight again? The question surprised even her as she said it aloud, revealing more about her own uncertainty than she had intended to share. Lucas did not answer immediately, choosing instead to look toward the factory for a long, silent moment before speaking. When he finally responded, his voice carried none of its usual guarded calm, replaced instead by something closer to quiet conviction. I just want people who work honestly, he said, to still have somewhere to return to every single morning. Vivian felt those words settle into her chest with a weight she had not expected from such a simple sentence. There was no strategy in what he said, no hidden calculation designed to move her toward a particular decision. It was, she realized, the exact opposite of everything she had built her career around. And yet it felt more true than anything she had heard in years. Standing beside him in the fading light, Vivian understood that this moment marked a turning point neither of them could undo. Whatever decision she made next would define not just the factory's future, but her own understanding of what leadership actually meant. For a long moment, neither of them spoke again, the sound of the factory settling into its evening rhythm the only thing filling the space between them. Vivian found herself thinking back to every negotiation she had ever won, every deal celebrated with champagne and headlines, and realized none of it had ever felt as significant as this quiet exchange beside a chain-link fence. Lucas finally broke the silence himself, adding softly that he had spent years believing his work with machines was enough, that fixing broken things quietly was its own form of redemption. But standing there, watching workers walk toward gates that might soon be locked forever, he admitted that quiet redemption sometimes was not enough on its own. Sometimes a person had to step forward and use everything they had learned, even the parts of themselves they had tried to leave behind. Vivian understood, in that moment, that she was not the only one being asked to change. Not long after that evening at the factory gates, Lucas agreed to take on the project, though his agreement came with conditions Vivian had never encountered from any partner before. There would be no mass layoffs disguised as restructuring, no unnecessary cuts made simply to satisfy short-term shareholder expectations. Every decision affecting the workers had to prioritize their stability first, treating people as the foundation of the business rather than expenses to be minimized. Financial records would remain completely transparent, visible to workers and management alike, with nothing hidden behind complicated corporate language. Vivian listened to each condition carefully, then agreed to all of them without the negotiation Lucas had clearly expected her to attempt. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she chose principle over projected profit, and the decision felt strangely liberating rather than frightening. The reaction from her own leadership team arrived almost immediately, and it was not the reaction Vivian had hoped for. Board members questioned her judgment openly, some in private meetings and others in tones sharp enough to reach beyond closed doors. Major shareholders expressed frustration at what they viewed as an emotionally driven decision rather than a strategically sound one. Vivian faced pressure from every direction, reminders of quarterly targets, warnings about investor confidence, and thinly veiled threats about her position within the very company she had built. Lucas remained entirely unmoved by any of it, continuing his work at the factory with the same steady focus he brought to every machine he had ever repaired. His calm presence became, unexpectedly, the one constant Vivian could rely on while everything else around her seemed to shake. For the first time in her professional life, Vivian found herself standing firmly on the side of values rather than pure financial outcome, and the shift did not go unnoticed. Colleagues who had once admired her ruthless efficiency now watched her with confusion, unsure how to categorize this unfamiliar version of their chief executive. Some quietly respected the change, recognizing something honest in her new approach that had been missing before. Others saw only weakness, convinced that sentiment had clouded judgment that once made her one of the most feared negotiators in the industry. Vivian heard both reactions and found she cared less about either than she once would have expected. What mattered now was whether the factory and the people inside it would still be standing months from that difficult evening. Vivian began holding weekly meetings directly with factory workers, something no executive at her level had ever bothered to do at any of her company's other facilities. She listened to complaints about outdated safety equipment, suggestions for improving production without cutting corners, and worries about job security that no press release had ever addressed honestly. Lucas often stood quietly at the back of these meetings, not because he needed to be there, but because his presence reminded everyone that trust had to be earned continuously rather than declared once and forgotten. Slowly, the atmosphere inside the factory began to shift, workers speaking more openly, supervisors reporting problems instead of hiding them out of fear. Vivian noticed the change in productivity numbers eventually. But she noticed the change in people's faces first, and that mattered to her more than any report ever could. For the first time, she understood that transparency was not a policy to announce. It was a habit that had to be practiced every single day without exception. As the deal moved into its final and most critical stage, opposition against Vivian and Lucas grew sharper and considerably more coordinated than either of them had anticipated. Rival companies, sensing an opportunity to weaken Vivian's position, began spreading misleading information designed to damage confidence in the entire restructuring plan. Reports appeared suggesting the factory was far less stable than official records indicated, seeding doubt among investors who had initially supported the arrangement. Meanwhile, certain shareholders were quietly approached by outside parties, offering incentives to withdraw their support entirely, hoping to collapse the deal before it could be finalized. Pressure mounted from multiple directions simultaneously, each attack calculated to isolate Vivian just enough to force her hand. It became clear that surviving this final stage would require far more than good intentions or careful planning alone. One competitor in particular, a firm that had long envied Vivian's rapid rise through the industry, funded an entire campaign designed to portray her decisions as reckless and sentimental rather than sound business strategy. Anonymous sources appeared in trade publications questioning her judgment, suggesting that personal involvement with a factory mechanic had clouded her ability to lead objectively. Vivian read those articles alone in her office late one night, feeling for the first time in years the particular sting of an attack aimed not just at her company, but at her character directly. She considered, briefly, retreating to safer ground, issuing a statement distancing herself from Lucas and the factory entirely to protect her reputation. Instead, she called an emergency meeting with her closest advisors and told them plainly that she would not abandon a decision simply because it had become inconvenient to defend. That single choice, made in anger and conviction rather than calculation, marked the moment her team realized she had truly changed. Lucas approached the growing crisis the way he approached every difficult machine that had ever come through his shop, methodically, patiently, and without unnecessary panic. He gathered detailed technical evidence, proving the factory's equipment was not only stable, but capable of significantly higher output than competitors had claimed publicly. His reputation, built over years of honest work rather than empty promises, carried unusual weight among engineers and industry experts who trusted his assessments completely. Vivian, meanwhile, drew on skills she had spent her entire career developing, rallying nervous investors, addressing false claims directly, and rebuilding confidence one difficult conversation at a time. Where Lucas offered proof grounded in mechanical reality, Vivian offered leadership grounded in genuine conviction rather than rehearsed corporate language. Together, Their combined strengths created something neither of them could have accomplished working entirely alone. The final confrontation took place during a tense shareholder meeting, where the future of the factory would ultimately be decided once and for all. Vivian stood before people who had once trusted her instincts completely, and now openly questioned every decision she had made in recent weeks. She spoke without notes, describing not just numbers and projections, but the workers she had met, the families depending on those jobs, and the community built around that factory for generations. Lucas remained quietly present throughout the meeting, offering technical clarity whenever doubts arose about the equipment or long-term viability of production. Slowly, argument by argument, the tide within the room began shifting back toward genuine support rather than skeptical hesitation. By the meeting's end, the deal moved forward, the factory's future secured, and thousands of jobs preserved through a combination of courage and honest evidence. News of the successful outcome spread quickly through the town, bringing a wave of relief to families who had spent weeks fearing an uncertain future. The factory remained open, workers kept their positions, and the international agreement Vivian had originally pursued was ultimately completed on far more balanced and human terms. Yet everyone involved understood that the true victory extended well beyond financial figures or contractual success recorded in official documents. Trust, once nearly broken between corporate leadership and the workers who depended on them, had been carefully and deliberately rebuilt through visible, consistent action. Vivian had proven, both to her critics and to herself, that strength and compassion were not opposing forces after all. For Lucas, the outcome confirmed something he had believed quietly for years: that honest work, done for the right reasons, could still change outcomes that seemed impossible to fix. The town itself seemed to exhale after months of uncertainty. Small businesses that depended on factory wages, slowly regaining the confidence to plan beyond a single season at a time. A diner near the factory gates, once nearly empty during the height of the crisis, filled again with workers celebrating quietly over coffee and late breakfasts before early shifts. Local newspapers, the few that remained, ran stories not about Vivian's company or its financial performance, but about families who no longer had to consider leaving the only home they had ever known. Vivian read those stories with a kind of satisfaction entirely different from anything she had felt after closing even her largest previous deals. There was no stock price attached to the relief on Diane's face when she thanked Vivian personally outside the factory gates one final time. It was, Vivian realized, the first business outcome in her career that she measured not in dollars, but in the simple fact that people could sleep peacefully again. 1 year passed following the difficult months surrounding the factory's uncertain future, and the changes that followed proved far more lasting than anyone had initially expected. The factory itself operated at full strength, its production numbers steady, and its workforce more secure than it had been in over a decade. Families who had once feared losing everything now spoke about long-term plans again, a level of confidence that had been missing from the community for years. Vivian's leadership style had transformed almost entirely from the version of herself that first walked into Lucas's shop with a folder full of numbers. She built a company culture centered on respect, transparency, and genuine investment in the people who made her business function every single day. Colleagues who had once questioned her judgment now pointed to that period as the moment her leadership truly matured into something far more meaningful. Lucas, despite everything that had happened, remained exactly where he had always been, running the same small repair shop with the same quiet dedication that first caught Vivian's attention. He turned down every offer of an executive position, every proposal involving expensive homes or public recognition for the role he had played. Influence and comfort meant little to him compared to the simple satisfaction of fixing what was broken with his own 2 hands. Vivian visited him often now, no longer carrying contracts or strategic proposals, but simply choosing to spend time in a place that had taught her something invaluable. One quiet afternoon, watching him work on yet another aging engine, she finally asked him a question that had lingered in her mind for months. "Have you ever regretted any of it?" she asked softly, referring to everything he had walked away from years earlier. Lucas paused, wiped his hands slowly on a worn cloth, and looked at her with the same calm expression she had come to know so well. "Money helps a business grow larger," he said finally. "But people are the ones who decide how long it manages to survive." Vivian smiled at that, recognizing the same quiet certainty that had confused her so completely the very first day they met over a folder full of numbers he refused to even open. She thought about how far she had traveled since then, not in distance, but in understanding, moving from a woman who measured worth in valuation to one who measured it in the steadiness of a community rebuilding itself. Lucas asked her, in turn, whether she regretted any of the battles fought on his behalf, the board members alienated, the shareholders who still occasionally questioned her judgment behind closed doors. She shook her head without hesitation, telling him that some fights were worth every bit of difficulty they demanded, especially the ones that changed who a person became afterward. He nodded slowly, understanding exactly what she meant, having lived through his own version of that same difficult transformation years earlier. Between them passed something unspoken, but entirely clear, a recognition that both had been changed permanently by choosing people over profit when it would have been far easier not to. Vivian considered his words in silence, understanding them now in a way she could not have fully grasped during their very first meeting. The two of them stood together outside the factory that had once nearly closed forever, now humming steadily with life and purpose once again. They were no longer simply a powerful executive and a stubborn mechanic negotiating across an impossible divide between two different worlds. They had become something far simpler and far more meaningful. Two people who shared the same quiet belief about what truly makes a business worth saving. As the sun began to set behind the factory that evening, casting long shadows across the parking lot where workers still lingered after their shift ended, Vivian and Lucas stood side by side in comfortable silence. Neither felt the need to fill the quiet with words, a comfort that had grown slowly between them over the past year of shared struggle and eventual triumph. What connected them now was not a contract, nor a shared professional interest, but something built through honesty, patience, and mutual respect earned the hard way. Vivian had learned that true value could never be measured entirely in numbers, no matter how impressive those numbers appeared on paper. Lucas had learned that walking away from something broken did not always mean giving up. Sometimes it simply meant waiting for the right reason to return. Together, they understood something that neither corporate strategy nor personal ambition alone could ever fully teach. A truly great business, they had both come to believe, was never measured by its market valuation or the size of its quarterly earnings report. It was measured instead by the lives it protected, the families it supported, and the quiet dignity it offered to everyone who depended on it. That belief carried both of them forward, long after the factory crisis had passed, shaping every decision they made together in the months that followed. Vivian continued building a company defined by integrity rather than fear, while Lucas continued repairing machines that others had long since given up on saving. Their partnership, born from an unlikely refusal and a single powerful question, grew steadily into something neither had expected to find. It became a relationship built not on wealth, power, or convenience, but on respect, trust, and values, strong enough to outlast every storm still waiting ahead of them.